But also, first of all, thank you to all of you for coming here high noon on Thursday to listen to me present a little bit about the work I've been doing the past, I think it's 4 years now, since I've been at Tech as a graduate student. I think even though that's a little bit of an extended timeline, I am still grateful that I've been able to be here and been able to be a part of some of these things the whole time. So I'm excited to share some of these things with you. Okay, so piping plovers, many people might know, but also there's obviously a dearth of us plover students, so, but we'll reiterate some of these facts. They're a small-bodied shorebird that is endemic to North America, and the adults, when they migrate from their non-breeding grounds back to their breeding grounds, these adults weigh about half as much of a stick of butter, so they're small to undertake some of these big migrations. They return to their breeding grounds beginning in late March and early April, so just about now to give you a sense of the time. And the males establish nesting territories and pair with females. And when these birds nest, the pair creates a shallow scrape in sand, cobble, or shell substrates where they lay a clutch of up to 4 eggs and incubate the clutch for about 4 weeks until the chicks hatch. And the chicks, when they hatch, are precocial and they're able to leave the nest just hours later. The chicks are led by their parents to foraging grounds where their preferred foraging habitats are usually moist or saturated sand and mud substrates, usually associated with bodies of water like island shorelines, pond shorelines, and the like. And these habitats usually have some of the highest diversity and abundance of their preferred prey items, which are some soft body invertebrates, arthropods, insects that are on and in the substrate. So plovers breed in 3 distinct regions in North America. And today, my research, I'm going to be focusing on the Atlantic coast population, which has been listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1986. And the Atlantic coast population breeds from Newfoundland, Canada, down south through North Carolina. And you can see just by looking at this range map that North Carolina is unique in the plover range because we have this nexus where the breeding range and the non-breeding range overlap. And so North Carolina, while it has a small breeding population, has a small overwintering population, also hosts migratory species. So they pretty much have plovers there throughout the entire year. And North Carolina, of course, as you can tell by the title, is where I conducted my research with piping plovers. Specifically, most of my work was concentrated at Cape Hatteras National Seashore. Center point here is at this little chin in the region called the Outer Banks, but Cape Hatteras actually starts up north here. It encompasses all of Pea Island National Wildlife Refuge and extends south down through the south end of Ocracoke Island. And then its nearest neighbor too is also a national seashore, Cape Lookout, which starts here and goes south down outside of the scope of this map. And these 3 areas combined host anywhere from about 75 to 90% of the state's breeding population in any given year. And North Carolina's coast is also a popular tourist destination. We get a lot of people from Virginia that go on vacation down there, so some of you might have experienced this firsthand. But at Cape Hatteras specifically, there's an estimated 2.5 million visitors a year that visit Cape Hatteras to especially recreate things like swimming, surf fishing, surfing, kayaking, and to do some of these recreational activities. In addition, a proportion of these visitors also use off-road vehicles or RVs to drive on the beach. And historically, beach driving on the Outer Banks was a mode of transportation, but with the pavement of Highway 12 and the connection of the Bonner Bridge, this has become a lot easier to drive on the highway, and so now beach driving is mostly a form of recreation. And the height of visitor use during the summer months is also coincides with a very busy, the height of the plover season, and also several other beach nesting species that occur there. And so as a plover whose life history remains or relies on remaining unnoticeable, they rely on their cryptic coloring to hide their eggs, themselves, their chicks. High amounts of visitor use on the beach can put these birds at risk, and it's been known for pedestrians and vehicles to trample and crush nests and chicks if they are left unprotected, because they can easily go unnoticed. And you can see that here. That's a tiny little plover chick. But don't worry, this is actually a plover scientist, and he fully knew that that was there. So this chick had a good fate, don't worry. And so these conflicts have occurred in many other places along the Atlantic coast, but specifically at Cape Hatteras, a lawsuit was brought by the Defenders of Wildlife and the National Audubon Society against the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that alleged inadequate resource protection according to several federal laws and statutes when it came to natural resources, especially endangered species. And so in 2008, an agreement called the Descent Decree was created amongst the parties to create an interim management plan specifically for off-road vehicles until the permanent management plan, which was implemented in 2012, was finalized. And the permanent management plan outlined areas for off-road vehicles that were either year-round routes, seasonal routes, or completely free, vehicle-free areas. And the plan also outlined management strategies for protocols, other beach nesting birds, and sea turtles that also come to lay their nests on land. And these management protocols primarily took the form of providing areas that were closed to vehicle and pedestrian access in anticipation of breeding activity, and then also in response to breeding activity. So here we have the same fencing, or these signs that are with twine and fencing. So these lines you can see here. So this area protects the habitat structure, and then if breeding activity, bird presence, or behavior was observed, say a nest was laid right here under the sign, these signs would then be moved to incorporate and incorporate this area and provide an area around here to protect that nest. So with the management plan, some research questions were also outlined. And specifically for plovers, Cape Hatteras was interested in, one, understanding what the reproductive rate was needed at Cape Hatteras in order to attain a growing population and what was reasonably attainable there. And the second question was their interest in what was the effectiveness of some of these current management strategies, like the buffer areas that protect nests and breeding activity. And some of these research questions is the genesis of the project and the stuff that I will be presenting today. So my thesis was an effort to start looking at some of these questions. So the first chapter is going to be comparing population growth of Cape Hatteras and then another plover population. My second chapter is going to be looking at some of the management strategies and how they relate to plover brood movement. And then my third chapter, while actually not specifically outlined at the beginning of my project, I think is still related to it. And it's talking about a different section of the life cycle in which plovers can still be protected at Cape Hatteras using these management strategies. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I guess chapter 1 is a good place to start. And again, this chapter was an effort to start answering one of these first research questions, and what reproductive rate is needed at Cape Hatteras. And the reproductive rate for growing populations of plovers throughout the Atlantic Coast Range was often considered to be the same, or needed to be the same across populations. But different areas of the range, since its listing, has seen much larger growth than other areas. And so, for instance, some previous work that had been looking at long-term trends in population estimates and estimates of reproductive output found that some areas had a very strong correlation with each other, and other areas had a much weaker correlation between population growth and reproductive output. And this pattern in the long term, about 30 years, suggested that maybe some areas just don't need as much reproductive output in order to grow about the same rate. And so it was suggested that perhaps there was a latitudinal trend in survival, because especially the area that North Carolina is in, often called the Southern Recovery Unit, had this really weak correlation with reproductive output and population growth. And so it was hypothesized that perhaps individuals that bred in the southern part of the range had higher annual survival and thus would not need to produce as many offspring to replace themselves from year to year. And there was some theories perhaps related to migratory distance, because of course North Carolina and some of the southern states are very close to the breeding range or even overlap, so perhaps individuals don't need to expend as much energy on the stressful migration in order to get to the non-breeding grounds. And so fortunately, we had a sister project going on. It's also still going on at Fire Island in New York that has seen some higher population growth, but that was also linked more strongly to reproductive output. And of course, my project going on at North Carolina. So we were able to see at do these exist in these two populations at the same time. So we could start asking the following questions. Do vital rates actually differ between the populations? Do we see this latitudinal trend, especially of survival? Based on these vital rates, does each population then need the same reproductive output, not only to maintain itself at the same level, but then also to grow? And then based on its performance, how are these populations, what are the growth trajectories of both of these populations? And so we conducted field work where we monitored nests when we located them during the breeding season, again starting in early April, usually to the middle of August. We found and monitored nests until they failed or hatched. We captured adults that incubated these nests and affixed these little plastic flags to their legs that were unique identifiers, allowing us to see them not only during the breeding season, but help them be located throughout the year when they left our breeding grounds. And then we also marked the chicks in the same way so that we could monitor them while they were, before they attained flight after they hatched, but then also in the same manner when they left our breeding grounds and migrated south and then back the next year. And so we know that populations can have several inputs that contribute to growth trajectories. And in this study, we used 3 metrics that have also been previously used in study of plover population dynamics. So that allowed us to compare not only its populations simultaneously through space, but also to some other populations through time. And I'm gonna, excuse me, go over some of the methods extremely quickly, and I'd be happy to talk about a lot of these later, but in the instance of time, I just want to put these up there. We estimated daily nest success, and we were also able to use these individual marks on chicks and adults to estimate survival rates. Okay, so we'll just go ahead and jump into some of these results. So nest success we found to be variable at each site and through year, which is, again, not an uncommon occurrence in plover population studies. So this was no big surprise to find. A chick survival also can be very variable for each year and a lot of other previous plover studies. But I do want to mention here specifically that some of these rates of chick survival in North Carolina as a illustration, our highest level of chick survival was one of the lowest rates that we have estimated in Fire Island. And then survival of individual adults, we can see here again, because we had 2 years of overlap for estimates, were actually relatively similar for each site in the years that they overlapped. So we could take these vital rates and feed this into an estimate of population growth, or lambda. I'm not going to go over the specifics of this, but basically we can take these annual survival rates and nest success, reproductive rate, and estimate population growth, lambda, or we can rearrange this, do a little algebra, set lambda equal to 1. So that means our population is neither growing nor shrinking, and then solve for B, which is birth rate, or the reproductive output that we need. So when we do rearrange this, when we do set lambda equal to 1 and assume that our population is maintaining itself, neither growing or shrinking, what reproductive rate then do we need? Well, we actually need about almost an identical population rate, or excuse me, reproductive rate for each, even though that we saw that we had some pretty variable vital rates within each population. But does that then mean each population is actually at this level of stationarity? Well, in short, no. You can see obviously that North Carolina in the 3 years of our study never met this estimated population growth rate of 1, meaning it was declining the whole time, whereas in Fire Island, we at least had 3 years that attained or exceeded this estimated population growth rate. So let's revisit some of these hypotheses that I mentioned earlier. What about this survival hypotheses? Perhaps we don't need as many chicks produced per year in North Carolina because the adults survive better there. We'll go back to this figure and look at the two overlapping times. And while they're very similar, both in the yearly estimates, there's obviously some annual variation here. If nothing else, when we look at annual averages, North Carolina tended to be lower, 4% lower. And again, if this is indicative of long-term trends, this could make a difference in a smaller population. But as we can tell right now, they aren't having that much higher survival rate that was previously hypothesized. In addition, during our study, North Carolina wasn't meeting this productivity rate to even maintain itself. And it hasn't been doing that historically. Where we have here in this top panel, this is the estimated or the reported reproductive rate, fledglings per pair, chicks per pair, in the past 30 years. And not once has it met this estimated just over 1 chick per pair. And yet, over the past 30 years, this population estimate has sometimes doubled or even grown much faster in other years. And yet, it's not producing enough chicks to even keep itself from declining. So how is this population still here? So an input that we didn't talk about, as I mentioned earlier, is immigration. And immigration is pretty difficult itself to quantify, but from a plover's perspective, it's actually difficult to explain. These birds have a very strong tie to their breeding grounds. Even young that are known to disperse more have a pretty high rate of site fidelity. So the idea that these large levels of immigration can be sustaining a population long-term is actually considered unusual for this species. And as of right now, we don't know where these birds are actually coming from, but if we assume that the nearest neighbors are the most likely ones to be contributing, all we have to do is look at the rest of the Southern Recovery Unit and look at the population estimates here, which were from 2017. And our home state, the Eastern Shore of Virginia, has by far the largest plover population so far in the neighboring states. So, this would be a good place to start, but we definitely don't have evidence yet of this, but I think this is something worth exploring. So from this analysis, it suggests that immigration compensates for this low reproductive output and not higher survival as it was potentially first hypothesized. And keeping, more study of immigration, especially in plover populations. Again, it's of interest, but it's not thought to have been such a sustaining population input. So more look at that. But if we know that this population has been sustained in the long term instead of reproductive output, what does that mean for current management efforts to increase reproductive output? And so this leads me into my second chapter, which is going to be looking at some of these brood behaviors and the current management practices. And again, this chapter is designed to start looking at the second research question about the effectiveness of these management strategies. So there have been several previous studies that have examined the effect of human disturbance on plover reproduction, especially chick survival. It's been well observed that higher instances of human presence, human disturbance has led to low chick survival. And the mechanisms that are usually associated with this, is because disturbance lowers foraging rates. Chicks have to, don't spend as much time foraging. They spend more time avoiding disturbances and might not have adequate nutrition to fledge or survive until the next year. However, the other side to this coin is this extra energy expenditure. If they spend a lot more time moving around and expending energy and not foraging, that can compound the foraging time lost and really hit them with a double whammy. To mitigate the costs of human disturbance to plovers, the use of productive buffers is a key component in management of plovers. And at Cape Hatteras, these zones are set at distances specific to certain stages of the life cycle, or the breeding cycle, excuse me, and they're delineated again by these symbolic signs and twine that is tied between each post. And this fencing is erected prior to the breeding season to protect nesting habitat, but it's also moved in to accommodate breeding activity and where nests are laid. And chicks also receive these buffers as management. But of course, like nests, which are stationary, the plovers, which can leave the nest just hours later, they move a lot. And so the buffers are dynamic and they move with them. But obviously this, if the plovers are moving around a lot, this could potentially mean a lot of work for managers, especially if they don't stay in areas that are currently protected for nesting habitat. So if we could predict how broods move, then potentially we could increase the efficiency of these buffers. And then if chicks increase their movement rates when reacting to disturbances, this could be evidence of this extra mechanism that compound the reduced amount of foraging rates that they have. So the current management plan for plover buffers at Cape Hatteras National Seashore is a minimum of 100 meters away from pedestrians from plover broods, and at least 200 meters away for ORVs or off-road vehicles. And this 200-meter buffer is in place if continuous monitoring by management personnel is present to keep eyes on plover broods. But if it's not, the buffer is expanded to 500 meters away from ORV traffic. And I'll mention again that these fences that are erected are not fences in the sense that they keep plovers in. They're just designed to keep compliance of people out in a way. So the plover chicks don't really know that they're there and can potentially leave them. So if the birds aren't kept in, how can we ensure that they are kept in by our management strategies? So we approach this from two potential ends of the spectrum of management. And once was if managers are only able to check on broods once daily, or if they're able to provide this continuous daylight monitoring on the ground. And to parallel these two strategies, we used two analysis strategies, which was to estimate the daily movement. So from one day to the next, how far do broods move? And then also this hourly movement, how far can broods move in a single observation period. How quickly can they potentially leave an area without quick action by management? And again, we used the same methods that I spoke about earlier. And when the chicks hatch, each day we would search for broods using spotting scopes, binoculars, and once found, we would estimate their location using a rangefinder and compass, which allowed us to estimate the coordinates of their location without approaching them directly. Let's see, test if that works, yep. So we would observe their behavior when we located them for 5-minute segments. We would randomly select a focal chick in the brood. We would record the dominant type of habitat that the brood was in, their behavior every 10 seconds for 5 minutes, and then every foraging attempt that they made. And it was a lot of this, which is really excellent as an observer to have all the time. So then after we conducted the 5-minute behavior observations, we would conduct modified point counts of potential disturbance sources around the brood. And we would do this in a radius of 500 meters, and we would count all occurrences of potential and perceived predators, including gulls, crows, even birds of prey that aren't predators of plovers but elicit a disturbed reaction from plovers. We would include pedestrians, vehicles, if there were any present, pretty much everything in a radius of 500 meters that we could observe. And we would collect these data on brood location, behavior, and disturbance every 1 to 2 days as we could locate the brood until they reached fledging age at 25 days. And we would collect at least 2 of these each time that we observed a brood during a single observation period. And we spent about 21 hours total in the 2015 to 2017 directly observing broods, but trust me, we spent a lot longer looking for them. So again, using these brood data, we had 2 data types where we estimated the straight line distance between 2 daily brood locations, and then we also estimated the straight line distance between 2 locations during these continuous observations when we had eyes on the chicks the whole time. So we estimated on average that chicks moved a little over 70 meters per day, but the observed distances tended to vary between 0, which was usually chicks remaining in the bowl a little bit longer at their nest site, but also could be much larger than this. And this movement tended to increase with age, although this wasn't necessarily a great predictor of it, it was the best predictor. And if you look at this histogram of the amount of movements, the frequency of movements here that we observed, and these ranges of distance, you'll know that a grand majority of them were within this 100-meter distance from one point to the next that encompasses for pedestrians, and then a much larger majority of them were either between this 200 and 500-meter buffer for ORVs. For hourly movements, they could move as an average of over 180 meters per hour, but again, this tended to vary pretty widely. And with the same similar histogram, again, the frequency with which we saw these movements, again, much of them were contained within this 100-meter pedestrian buffer. Many more of them were contained within the buffers needed for vehicles, but then actually, you know, there still were a number of them that were potentially larger than the largest buffer size used. And this movement was unrelated to a lot of factors that we tested that I'd be happy to talk about later. But since the interest of this was to decrease the amount of disturbance and how that related to the management of such, that's what I'm going to mention here real quick. We actually only observed chicks being disturbed, this tiny little blue fraction right here, a very small amount of time, which is great. You know, we like to see chicks that are pretty well undisturbed. and spend much of their time either performing maintenance activities or foraging. And I have to say that the disturbance instances that we did see, none of them were related to human factors such as pedestrians or vehicles. So I think that starts giving us some good insight on the success of the current management strategies. So we learned that brood movement can be very variable, which obviously in itself can make some management practices difficult. But we didn't find a strong correlation between movement and factors such as predation risk or disturbance. And of course, there could be a few things at play. Like I mentioned, we didn't see a lot of disturbance behavior. So that in itself is good, but we just might have not been able to then measure their reactions to disturbance. So if you're going to have something that's missing, I think that's probably a good story for the plovers. And based on some of these movement rates and the distances that they could move in this amount of time, it seems that this continuing monitoring of broods appears necessary. And if you would have noticed that they moved smaller distances per day than they could per hour. And this is probably because broods move many times, but their center of activity will move slowly day to day as they might shift their range where they're foraging or accessing different habitats. But these small movements still, if they're near the boundary of their management zones, could put them at risk. So continuous monitoring to make sure that if these quick, large movements do happen, that they can respond instantly on the ground to them and protect them from being, potentially trampled at the very worst or disturbed more. And then finally, while we didn't find much evidence of the increased movement and potential energy expenditure that comes from disturbance, the additional information that comes from this close monitoring could inform on what is potentially also driving this low chick survival that we saw in my first chapter, such as, chick predation. Okay. So now we're going to switch gears out of the breeding season to the post-breeding season. And like I said, this work was not originally part of our goal when we got to Cape Hatteras, but something that we happened to see during our normal breeding work there, and really is important to plover conservation, I think, as a whole. And I will mention too that this work has already been published about actually this time last year. So if you want, I'll do a shameless plug here for my own paper, but also, if you want some more details or want to talk about it more, it's available. So like I mentioned before, a lot of effort has gone into study plovers, especially on the breeding grounds, in order to start recovering and increasing the population of this imperiled species. But their migration is not very well understood. And mostly what exists up until now is some anecdotal evidence of migratory flocks, maybe some large ones that occur actually on the North Carolina Outer Banks. But this has mostly been with metrics such as number of birds seen per day and things like that. And that's a lot harder to track through time in a meaningful way. And a lot of the banding efforts that we use now and that are in current use for plovers along the Atlantic coast are actually fairly recent. And so a lot of times, a lot of birds were marked non-uniquely, not like those flags that I showed earlier. And so it was hard to tell if you were seeing the same individual over and over again or if there were new ones coming in. So as part of the breeding season, we conduct surveys and count and recite banded plovers, again, to find their nests primarily, but also to get an idea of who is there and not. And so the outset of this map, like I mentioned, this is Ocracoke Island here. This is an area of Ocracoke called South Point. And we were conducting our normal breeding surveys here. I think in 2015, there were 4 pairs of breeding birds here, and it varies each year from about 2 to 4 or 5. And while we were doing these normal breeding activities, again, like this black outline right here, this is an area reserved and closed for breeding with the management plan. So we survey this whole area. This is about 200 hectares. We started noticing in early to mid-July that a lot more plovers than 2 to 4 pairs were all of a sudden started showing up, especially banded ones that we knew weren't breeders from our area. So when we returned in 2016, we started incorporating more of these migrants into our surveys. And so South Point is beautiful. I highly recommend you go there if you haven't been there before, because it's one of my favorite spots I've ever been. And it's pretty unique actually to this chain of islands. Like I mentioned, it's a spit on Ocracoke Island. It's mostly characterized by very low mud and sand flats. There's pockets of ephemeral pools, algal mats in some areas. So portions that we survey are more similar to the suitable breeding habitat. Like I mentioned, we're looking for breeding pairs there. So some shell beds and some dunes. And because it's so low, it partially floods twice every day with the high tide that comes in, but even just with a moderate amount of rainfall. And not only seems to be popular with plovers, but also other shorebirds. So like I mentioned in 2016, we made a stronger effort to start incorporating these surveys of migrants that were at South Point. And we would do our normal surveys 1 to 2 times per week. And basically we were just doing counts of both marked and unmarked birds. So marked birds being these ones with flags or individual band combinations. And then unmarked ones that we could tell definitely did not have any human applied bands to them. And when we observed these marked birds, we could identify individuals based on the unique band and flag codes that they carried. And like I mentioned before, banding efforts have increased in the Plover range, especially on the Atlantic coast. And a large majority of the banded birds that we saw did originate or were banded on breeding sites along the Atlantic coast, but we also would get occasional individuals from the Great Lakes population, which is actually endangered under the Endangered Species Act, and then the threatened Great Lakes population, or excuse me, Great Plains. And then also have some individuals that were banded in the Bahamas during their non-breeding season. And so we used this model that was proposed by Lyons et al. In 2016, and again, I'd be happy to talk more about this, but basically it combined a simple binomial count model of our counts of marked and unmarked birds, along with a survival model that allowed us to both estimate the passage population in this area and also how long they stayed in the area. So when I say we saw a lot of plovers, what does that actually mean for this imperiled species? So from our modeling, we estimated that in the migratory period from July through October, there was an estimated about 570 plovers that used this one site during fall migration in 2017. And, you know, what is 570 plovers? Well, when we compare it to that year's actual population estimate, that comprises about, or represents about 15% of the Atlantic coast population. So lots of plovers are using this area over 4 months. Well, actually, we had about half of the total population here on the single day, the peak of migration on our survey on August 1st, that had almost 300 plovers, which, oops, again, represents about 8% of that breeding population on the Atlantic coast. So this work was the first to start quantifying these migratory plovers in an area that was anecdotally thought to be very important to them, but certainly not in these numbers. And additionally, we estimated that plovers were staying on average, depending on the group of individuals, 4 to 7 weeks at South Point, which is not a non-negligible amount of time. And so because of their high fidelity to their sites in the breeding grounds and the wintering grounds, we can probably safely assume that they have this high rate of fidelity to areas where they migrate. And so this area can possibly host a very substantial portion of the Atlantic coast population annually. So from these three ecological perspectives of the plover's life cycle, we can start to tell that North Carolina has a really interesting story to tell with plovers. From a demographic perspective, we found that immigration likely plays a significant role in the population dynamics there. And this means that it also can affect its neighbors and has larger reaching consequences outside of North Carolina. The management strategies designed for plover chicks are, reducing human disturbance under their current strategies, but exploring the mechanisms that have been leading to these low chick survival rates that we've been seeing during our study and long term can also help or, be helped, with some of these continuous monitoring strategies to be used. And then also, just a small portion of Cape Hatteras itself is an important stopover location for migratory plovers. And this could have impacts flyway wide for this species every year. And so by these results, from these three perspectives, North Carolina has an important role to play in the conservation of plovers. And we knew it was unique because the ranges overlapped, but now we have some ecological evidence. And combining the previous studies or previous findings of plovers elsewhere along the Atlantic coast and with these new data would be a comprehensive step in the future towards plover conservation here and throughout the flyway. So this work was a huge effort by many people, both with me. I was able to do this work as part of funding with Cape Hatteras National Seashore, and then also the work that was conducted in New York was funded by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Fish and Wildlife Service. I want to thank all the management units, properties that allowed us to conduct this monitoring. While we were there, it's been a huge effort. There's a lot of people involved and many agencies, and I also want to thank all of the many people on the ground that I was constantly calling throughout the plover season, because coordinating a lot of these efforts in order to, look at these birds during a really sensitive time of their life cycle takes a lot of work. And also a special thank you to the lovely women that helped me collect data in the field. I definitely couldn't have done it on my own. And I'm surprised that, with as hard as we worked and stuff, that we could even, do it just the two of us every year. So that was a huge effort. So I especially have a lot of other people to thank here that are in this room. I want to thank a special thank you to my committee members. Dr. Dan Catlin, Dr. Jim Frazier, and Dr. Sarah Carpenter. Here, I'll do this not as much. There we go. It's a little less distracting. They all have been extremely important mentors for me and have made me a better scientist. And I owe a lot to them, so thank you. And also to everyone in the Virginia Tech Shorebird Lab. Told myself I wasn't going to do this. And my friends and family, you guys are great. And I really couldn't have done this without you. So thank you. There's so many more people too. And I wish I had another hour to talk about how great everyone is. But just know that I owe you guys a lot. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. I know, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Do we know how piping Plover navigates from?
I'll repeat this for the recording that we have. The question is, do we know how they navigate to and from the breeding grounds? And I think the short answer is no. I think with a lot of other migratory species, especially when it comes to using magnetic fields to navigate, that's definitely one of the first things. I think there's maybe some thinking that are doing more on the large scale migratory movements. Some of the research is still coming out, but there might be different management strategies between adults and young. The big question, of course, is how do they know? And then how do birds that have never done it before know where to go? So there might be some different strategies that either incorporate things like that or landmark navigation, maybe using waterways, because not only on the Atlantic coast, you have the big ocean on one side of you where they nest, in the Great Plains and the Great Lakes, staying close to big river systems like the Missouri, Mississippi River. Potentially they use something like that, but that's very, that's being newly explored, I think, right now. So I don't think there's a good answer to that yet. Yeah.
Do you have any speculation on where immigrants are coming from?
Yeah, the question is, do I have any speculation on where immigrants are coming from? And I think, yeah, there needs to be a closer look at the nearest neighbors, which is Virginia, since they have a much larger population. I think, just the distance is the shortest there, and the numbers, so the probabilities maybe are higher. But as I've been there, we've actually had dispersal of individuals to and from areas as far away as New Jersey and New York. Whether that makes a meaningful impact or those are just occurrences that have happened randomly, we don't really know yet. Again, it's mostly been based on boundary sites of nesting individuals. And I think in around 2010, there had been an individual from the Great Lakes population that nested at Cape Lookout for a year or two, which was actually the first instance of known interpopulation dispersal. So that was interesting, but I think that hasn't been reported yet since. So yeah, Ashley.
Fantastic presentation, great example.
Thank you.
A question for you about your recommendation for continuous monitoring.
Sure.
Could you explain a little bit more about what that would entail if the Park Service was doing it?
Mm-hmm.
That's who would actually do it?
Yeah.
And then I didn't quite catch why you assumed that was necessary, given that you weren't actually seeing disturbance events occurring and most of the species were actually staying within the buffer zone.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll repeat your question again too, and let me see if I've got the two parts. One is just what would the continuous monitoring entail for managers then, and then why I think that would be a good idea based on what we observed. Sure. So mostly what it does entail is something that we did very similarly, which is where you try to approach or think where a brood is, either based on where someone has seen it previously, and try to approach it usually in a very inconspicuous way, usually like through the dunes. You kind of like hide yourself. We spent a lot of time sitting in like really sandy, buggy dunes trying to hide from these plover broods, but still watch them. So it's mostly that, and just being able to keep an eye on them and know where they're going continuously. And so actually, especially at Cape Hatteras, they are doing that now as part of that smaller off-road vehicle buffer size. And that's able to keep smaller beach closures and keep human access to different areas, because if you know where they are, then you know where they are, and don't have to worry about them running elsewhere. And mostly that was, I think, is needed because it might not be watching them being disturbed as much, and so there's a question of, are they just avoiding areas where there are people and vehicles anyway because they perceive them as threats? I think that's something to still investigate. But if another predator like a gull or a coyote or something comes and runs out, or we've actually witnessed several instances of ghost crab predation that they react to and then can flee from. if those movements then cause them to kind of forget everything else and then run outside the buffers, if someone is there watching them, they can potentially go out and halt traffic so that there's not this continuous flow in really busy areas. Or if they seem like they're going to stay there, then erect more of these the symbolic fencing to make the buffer a little bit more permanent.
So did you see those actual changes occurring while you were there, the need for them?
Yeah, in some instances. And one confounding factor that I think I mentioned real briefly, but on the ground it makes a difference is, again, they close off these areas for nesting habitat, which can incorporate some areas of brood rearing habitat. And so that in itself is a very permanent structure, and it can be expanded to incorporate nests and unfledged young. But that in itself can provide a buffer that might be larger than what is outlined in the management plan. So they might not always be receiving a 200 or 500 meter buffer. It could be larger than that. But we did see them do some movements to avoid, predators, even other plovers that were being territorial and interacting with them. That would create some spatial separation and movements after those. But I think there was a lot of variation, so we didn't see a very strong signal of what we observed. And then, when you lump it all in with the averages and stuff, then how that comes out to be important. So, yeah.
Are there any other places like South Point, like where you have like a really high, where it seems like a high density of plovers, like anywhere else, or is that kind of?
Yeah, so the question was, are there any other places like South Point? And that's kind of the uniqueness, is that nowhere, especially during migration, but even on both on the wintering grounds, which are surveyed very regularly, and especially at 5-year intervals, some of these counts were larger than even the overwintering counts in a certain area. The density, I think, is something that could be explored again too. But there's some areas of Cape Lookout. Again, some of those reports that had been seen previously were at Cape Lookout. And so actually, that's what we're going to be continue to investigating, is the interaction between this group of islands, because they're very similar in like geography, topography to South Point, and potentially have their own extra group of plovers. And might have individuals going back and forth, sharing areas, but there might be an additional group of plovers that are similar to this in size. So, and this hasn't been really seen pretty much anywhere else in the migratory range, especially with since it starts happening during the breeding season. Plovers are very closely monitored during the breeding season, and this hasn't really been reported by anyone anywhere else. So.
Understanding your objectives on the sort of the middle piece was to see the effectiveness of the strategy management program.
Right.
This may be an unfair question, but are there any populations that are not subject to protection or a management strategy that could be used to look at different sort of under a management phase versus those that had no protection or anything? I wonder if there's a difference there in what those movements would have been, kind of habituation effect that strategy.
Yeah, so the question was if there's any other population that aren't managed in the same way, correct, that it might be unique to that area in terms of their movements. And I will say actually that our sister project in Fire Island, that's made up of a bunch of different management units, and each kind of have their own strategy when it comes to plover chicks. And I think in talking with a lot of people around the Atlantic coast, this idea of moving these beach closures with broods is actually kind of unique. So I think that's a little different. There are obviously areas, especially again, like on Virginia's eastern shore, that don't have anywhere near the human visitation. So maybe that management just isn't necessary. But I think most managers err on the side of caution that if there's going to be people there, they don't want to not protect them because we know that it can lower their survival and potentially reproductive output. But I think, continuing to explore if that's driven by a unique site specific trait, and also things like habitat configuration, because we know that they're drawn to certain areas. They need different habitat requirements than they do during nesting. So I think there's a lot of factors at play, and I think a good next step would be to use the same data that we collect at Fire Island in New York. And actually there was a study co-authored by Kelsey, but also with our former lab mate, Audrey DeRose Wilson, that was looking at some of these. It wasn't movement rates, but it's definitely things like foraging rates and survival on high use beaches, low use beaches, pedestrian use, vehicle use, and things like that. So
we're running out of time, but in the interest of our multimedia, we have one question from the folks here. So
Great.
Ann Hecht asks.
Yay! Hi, Ann.
Of course. Did brood movements ever cause the Park Service to have to close areas where people were, i.e. ask people to move?
I think yes. There are a lot, especially in certain areas, there's a lot of overlap of species, including colonial water birds, oyster catchers. And I'm trying to think, I know there's been areas where closures have been extended. I think there maybe was a time or two where people might have had to leave in anticipation or because broods were coming close, so they had to erect those. But I think some of the overlapping with pre-nesting closures and then buffers for other species might have encompassed those, or it had already happened. So I definitely would have to check, but I think that's a likely possibility. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, everybody join me in thanking Chelsea and
Thank you.